It was the sort of late spring morning that would have had even the most hard-hearted of souls waxing poetic. The sun glistened on freshly trimmed hedges, bees hovered in quiet industry over budding lavender, and the scent of lemon sponge and darjeeling wafted from under a striped marquee erected on the west lawn of Greystone Hall. Lady Margaret Lavinia Sedgwick, widow of Colonel Reginald Sedgwick and the self-declared presiding matriarch of Lower Bindwell, was hosting her annual Founders' Day tea, a tradition rooted in benevolence but laced with the sort of social obligation one could neither decline nor enjoy entirely. Among the attendees was Miss Jane Marple, seated modestly at a small wrought-iron table near the edge of the rose garden, sipping tea with her usual quiet attentiveness. She had been invited not out of familiarity. Lady Sedgwick considered Miss Marple a little too plain-spoken, but rather out of social duty. Miss Marple's reputation, after all, had a way of subtly imposing itself even where not explicitly welcomed. "There's something about the begonias this year," Miss Marple murmured, more to herself than to her tea companion, a dithering Mrs. Clegg from the parish committee. "Not quite as cheerful, as though they know something we don't." Mrs. Clegg blinked. "The begonias, Miss Marple?" But Jane's attention had drifted toward the large oak doors of the manor, now swinging open as a footman emerged, looking pale and stricken. A hush began to fall over the gathering. Moments later, Lady Sedgwick herself appeared, face pinched and lips tight. "I must ask everyone to remain calm," she announced, her voice brittle. "There has been an unfortunate incident. Please do not return to your cars just yet." Gasps broke out, followed almost immediately by the rustle of gossip. One could feel the entire garden pivoting on the precipice of drama. Miss Marple folded her gloved hands neatly in her lap, eyes narrowing almost imperceptibly. "An incident?" Mrs. Clegg whispered, already breathless with the thrill of being adjacent to scandal. No sooner had the question been asked than Inspector Crispin Hayward strode briskly from the house, followed by a constable and a grim-looking butler. His glance swept the gathering, landed on Miss Marple for a second longer than courtesy dictated, then turned to confer with Lady Sedgwick in hushed tones. A moment later, it was made official. The guests would not be allowed to leave. A man had been found dead in the morning room, a stately chamber on the ground floor used mostly for accounts and quiet reading. The cause of death had not yet been revealed, but what puzzled the inspector, even more than the body, was the door. It had been locked from the inside and from the outside. No broken glass, no other point of entry. Just a man, dead in a sealed room that no one could have entered or escaped from. Miss Marple tilted her head, her fingers lightly tapping the edge of her teacup. "Curious," she murmured. "Most curious. One does not often encounter a door that chooses loyalty to both sides." And as murmurs gave way to theories and the garden buzzed not with bees but with suspicion, Jane Marple remained where she was, quiet, watchful, and already considering what most others had missed. Not how the man had died, but who had truly wished him dead. The guests were still gathered in uneasy clusters on the west lawn, teacups forgotten and cake slices abandoned as the reality of the announcement began to sink in. The gentle breeze that earlier had lifted parasols and tickled lace now seemed colder, as though Greystone Hall itself had exhaled something long buried. A few ladies had begun murmuring prayers under their breath, while the younger attendees whispered wildly about locked doors and secret passages. Miss Marple, still seated, listened to it all without interruption. She sipped the remainder of her lukewarm tea and allowed herself to become invisible, something she had mastered years ago, to the great peril of those with secrets to hide. She had noticed the subtle flicker of alarm in Lady Sedgwick's eyes, not the shock of a friend confronted with tragedy, but the anxious calculation of a hostess whose reputation hung by a thread. That alone had been more revealing than anything said aloud. The constable, a square-shouldered young man named Ellis, began gently ushering the guests toward the drawing-room where they would be asked to remain until the inspector had taken statements. Miss Marple rose without protest, walking at her usual unhurried pace. She passed the grand double doors of Greystone Hall, which now loomed shut behind two uniformed men, and gave them a mild glance. If the dead man had indeed been found in the morning room, the layout of the house placed that chamber just off the main east corridor. She had visited once before, many years ago, when Colonel Sedgwick was still alive and the house was a place of stiff hospitality rather than brittle grandeur. Inside, the drawing-room buzzed like a disturbed hive. The guests, most of them villagers with nothing more violent in their lives than the occasional squabble over flower show ribbons, sat on chintz-covered settees and tufted stools, their voices rising in a symphony of speculation. Did you see how pale she looked? Not like a woman unacquainted with death, if you ask me. Who was the man, did anyone say? I heard it was her nephew, her brother's boy, just back from the colonies. No, it was the estate agent, or perhaps the piano tuner. Miss Marple settled into an upright chair near the window, where the lace curtains filtered the light into soft golden beams. She said nothing, but took in every face. Anxiety brought out interesting traits in people. The fidgeting of the fingers, the dry licking of lips, eyes that shifted too quickly, or didn't shift at all. Lady Sedgwick entered. Shortly after, followed closely by Inspector Hayward, whose expression was carved from duty and annoyance. He addressed the room with the same practiced calm he used for village brawls and misplaced livestock. "I ask for your patience," he said. "A man has died under circumstances we have yet to determine. Until we have a clearer understanding, no one may leave the premises." There were murmurs, gasps, and one sharp sniff from Miss Redley, the retired schoolmistress who had once marked Miss Marple's great-niece harshly on a grammar essay. "Who is it, Inspector?" asked Reverend Puckle, his hands trembling slightly as they gripped his knees. Hayward hesitated for a moment, then answered, "The deceased is Mr. Howard Blake, a guest of Lady Sedgwick's. He was staying here in connection with some personal business." This elicited another round of startled exclamations. Miss Marple, however, raised a single brow. Howard Blake. The name was vaguely familiar, one of those ephemeral village echoes that came and went like autumn mist. She seemed to recall hearing it mentioned at the bakery only last week, in connection with a disagreement about property. A voice cut through the whispers. What kind of personal business? The question came from Edmund Hargrove, a local solicitor whose permanent frown had deepened considerably since the announcement. He was seated stiffly, arms crossed, his body leaning ever so slightly toward Lady Sedgwick. Hayward deflected. "That's under investigation. At present, I'm interested in your movements this morning. If each of you could recount where you were between 10 and 11:30, that would be helpful." Miss Marple noted the time with a quiet flicker of interest. She had arrived shortly before 10:30, just as the garden party was beginning to swell with guests. That meant the death had likely occurred while they were all outside, distracted by sponge cake and polite compliments. "I was helping in the kitchen," offered Miss Beatrice Hartnell, Lady Sedgwick's niece and a frequent presence at church teas. "I didn't even know there was a guest staying in the house." That, Miss Marple thought, was a curious thing to say. Not, "I didn't see him," or "I didn't speak to him," but rather that she hadn't known he existed. Odd for someone living under the same roof. Inspector Hayward began taking names and locations, while Constable Ellis made careful notes. As each person spoke, Miss Marple folded their responses away into tidy compartments in her mind. She wasn't looking for inconsistencies just yet. She was listening for tone, watching for evasions, comparing each reaction not to guilt, but to the fear of being misunderstood. Lady Sedgwick's turn came, and her voice, customarily refined and deliberate, carried a thread of steel beneath the polish. "I was in the conservatory, arranging flowers with Mrs. Hargrove and Reverend Puckle. We were discussing Final details for the vicarage fundraiser. "I can confirm that," said Mrs. Hargrove quickly, too quickly, "though I don't remember seeing Mr. Blake this morning at all." "No one does," murmured Miss Marple, not loud enough for the inspector to hear, but enough that Mrs. Clegg turned to glance at her with nervous curiosity. Hayward's notebook snapped shut after the last guest had spoken. "Thank you. We'll be speaking to each of you again. For now, I'd like to ask Lady Sedgwick to remain, as well as anyone who had access to the morning room." Miss Marple rose and made her way discreetly toward the door. She had not been asked to stay, and that suited her just fine. But as she passed the footman standing awkwardly in the hallway, she paused. "Excuse me, young man," she said gently. "May I ask, was Mr. Blake occupying the eastern guest room?" The boy blinked. "Yes, ma'am." "How did you—" "Oh, just a hunch," she replied sweetly. "I noticed his suitcase when I came in earlier, unzipped and with a book on Caribbean law atop his clothes. An unusual interest for a country visitor, wouldn't you say?" She didn't wait for his reply. Instead, she drifted slowly down the hallway, retracing the route that would have led Mr. Blake from his room to the morning chamber. The thick carpet muffled her steps. She paused outside the door that remained closed, guarded now by a constable with a waxen face and eyes that didn't quite meet hers. "I'm sorry, madam. No entry." "Oh, I wouldn't dream of it," said Miss Marple. "Only if I may say so. I do hope someone thought to check both sides of the bolt. Some of those old locks have peculiar mechanics. One would be surprised how often people assume a door is locked from within when in fact, well, that would be telling." And with a soft, unreadable smile, she turned and walked away. Back in the drawing room, conversations had resumed in strained tones. Accusations hovered unspoken, but present. Someone in this house had wanted Mr. Blake gone, enough to orchestrate a locked-room death that now puzzled even the inspector. But not Miss Marple, not entirely. Already she had noticed the hesitation in Lady Sedgwick's phrasing, the uncertainty in Beatrice Hartnell's eyes, the sharp look exchanged between Edmund Hargrove and his wife that lasted just a moment too long. No, she did not yet know how Mr. Blake had died, or why. But she knew this. The truth was here, nestled within the tiny cracks of memory and guilt. And someone who thought themselves very clever, had forgotten that the smallest detail, the lightest inconsistency, could undo them entirely. All Miss Marple had to do was wait, and listen, and watch. She was very good at that. It was nearly 12:30 when Inspector Hayward stepped quietly into the morning room, now emptied of its fatal occupant and under temporary seal. The coroner had come and gone, taking the body of Mr. Howard Blake with him, but what remained was more baffling than the man himself. A door that had been locked from the inside by a bolt and locked again from the outside by a key, and no sign of forced entry or escape. The chamber was dignified, but not grand, with tall bookshelves, a polished writing desk, and 2 high-backed chairs positioned by the fireplace. One of those chairs bore a dark stain now hastily covered by a cloth. The air still smelled faintly of copper and lavender polish. Hayward crossed the room in silence, crouched beside the hearth, and examined the door bolt again. Solid brass. Clean. No sign of tampering. Then he stepped back and turned toward the window. It was latched, not just closed, but latched, snug, with no looseness in the frame. And outside, a sheer drop of 10 feet to the stone terrace, overlooked by the kitchen and scullery windows. No one could have climbed in that way unnoticed, nor leapt out without drawing some sort of attention. He sighed. It was, in every respect, impossible. And yet, at the far end of the corridor, Miss Marple stood beside a tall brass urn in the entry hall, making polite conversation with Reverend Puckle, who appeared both concerned and slightly flustered by the proximity of such calm insight. "But surely," he was saying, "if the room was locked both ways, then the poor fellow must have, well, taken his own life?" Perhaps, said Miss Marple gently, but one must always ask what a man has to gain by dying, particularly in someone else's house, in a locked room, and during a social gathering. It seems rather theatrical, don't you think? The Reverend blinked at her. Theatrical? Oh, yes. Quite so. People who intend to die usually prefer privacy. There's something deeply personal about the act. A statement made behind closed doors? Yes, but rarely with such puzzling dramatics. No, I suspect poor Mr. Blake didn't mean to die at all. Before Reverend Puckle could reply, Inspector Hayward emerged from the corridor and joined them. "Miss Marple," he said not unkindly, "might I have a word?" "Of course, Inspector." He led her aside, not far, but enough to drop the voices to a more discreet level. "Miss Marple, you've encountered strange deaths before. I don't suppose you formed any impressions?" "Only that your Mr. Blake seems to have made himself quite unpopular, without ever truly arriving." Hayward frowned. "You knew of him before today?" "No, but he left a strong impression in his absence. No one seemed to know where he was this morning. Several of the house's own residents claimed they didn't know he was here at all. That's very odd, don't you think?" "It is. Lady Sedgwick says he arrived 3 days ago. And yet his presence hasn't permeated. It suggests he was either kept away or made himself scarce. That tells us something about his purpose, or his reception." Hayward nodded slowly. "You think someone didn't want him here?" "I think," Miss Marple said with a faint smile, "that someone very much wanted him here, if only to ensure that he didn't leave." The inspector rubbed his chin, looking more thoughtful than before. "Do you mind," Miss Marple added delicately, "if I ask a rather unladylike question?" Hayward blinked. "Please." "Was there anything missing from the body? Wallet, papers, key?" He looked surprised. "The key to the outer lock was found in Mr. Blake's coat pocket. That much was certain. As for his personal effects, well, he had a letter in his waistcoat. Sealed, addressed to someone named Edmund." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though she betrayed no further reaction. "Curious. Indeed." At that moment, a loud voice interrupted them. Edmund Hargrove himself, emerging from the drawing-room in evident frustration. "This is absurd," he snapped. "You're holding us here like criminals, and for what? A man dies, yes, tragic, but must we all suffer as though we'd done it ourselves?" Hayward raised a hand with controlled authority. "Mr. Hargrove, I understand your frustration. We're moving as quickly as possible. I'll be asking for your continued cooperation." Edmund scoffed and stalked toward the front vestibule, muttering something under his breath about colonial charlatans. His wife, Judith, appeared moments later, hurrying after him with her brow furrowed and her lips tightly pressed together. Miss Marple tilted her head ever so slightly. "Inspector," she said softly, "do you suppose you might speak with Lady Sedgwick's housemaid? Not the upstairs girl. What was her name? Elsie? But the new one, the quiet one with the auburn hair. I believe she might have seen something." Hayward blinked. "You think so?" "She flinched when the death was announced. Not out of fear, but recognition." "Thank you," he said. "I'll look into it." Miss Marple inclined her head and returned to the drawing-room, where the atmosphere had begun to sour into exhaustion. The guests were restless now, their appetite for intrigue dulled by discomfort and suspicion. A low conversation had started near the fireplace, Mrs. Hargrove and Lady Sedgwick whispering in brittle tones, with Beatrice Hartnell seated nearby, hands clutched in her lap, looking increasingly pale. Miss Marple seated herself beside the younger woman, offering a gentle smile. "You look quite out of sorts, my dear." Beatrice turned to her, startled. "Oh, it's just the heat, I think. And the waiting." "Yes, waiting can be so very heavy, like the silence before the page turns." Beatrice's lips quivered faintly. She cast a nervous glance toward her aunt, then back at Miss Marple. "Did you know him?" Miss Marple shook her head. "No. Did you?" A pause. Not really. I mean, I saw him once or twice, but he kept to himself. That must have been hard, staying with people and not belonging. Beatrice looked down. Yes. Miss Marple touched her hand lightly. Harder still if he brought trouble with him. Something flickered in the girl's eyes, a spark of something withheld, repressed, but she said nothing, only nodded faintly. Across the room, Inspector Hayward re-entered with a small bundle in his hand, a folded piece of stationery, its seal now broken. He caught Miss Marple's eye before speaking. "The letter addressed to Mr. Hargrove," he said to the room, "was not personal. It was legal." Gasps rippled. It appears Mr. Blake had some connection to the title of this estate. He claimed rights to a parcel of land owned jointly by Colonel Sedgwick and a former partner in the West Indies. That partner, recently deceased, left a contested will, naming Mr. Blake as a partial heir. All heads turned at once to Lady Sedgwick, who sat very still. "This property?" she asked softly. "Part of it, or so Mr. Blake believed. He had come to negotiate." Miss Marple gave a barely perceptible nod. The motive was beginning to take shape. Not emotional, not romantic, but territorial. And old land disputes, she knew, often stirred the oldest grievances. But there was still the question of the door. Someone had gone to great lengths to stage a puzzle. The key in Blake's pocket, the double lock, the untouched window. It was too elaborate for panic, too controlled for rage. This was a deliberate death, wrapped in enigma, and Miss Marple had just remembered something that changed the timing entirely. The tea. There had been 3 teapots on the side table outside, one for Lady Sedgwick's blend, one for the guests, and a third, oddly placed, set aside and forgotten. That third pot had not been full when she glanced at it earlier. Nor had it been steaming, but the cup beside it, a pale green porcelain cup, had still been damp inside. Someone had poured a cup of tea before the party began. For someone not expected to join the garden gathering, and that meant Mr. Blake had already been dead when the guests first arrived. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap, quiet and composed, as the sun shifted again over the roses outside the tall windows. The scent of lavender was back, strong and unexpected. Lavender oil, a favorite among housemaids. She made a mental note to find the quiet one with auburn hair. It was, she suspected, nearly time for someone else to speak. Miss Marple's suspicions about the third teapot lingered in her mind as she moved with quiet deliberation toward the kitchen quarters, where the housemaids were now gathered under the watchful eye of Mrs. Pratt, the housekeeper. The air was thick with tension. Whispers ceased abruptly as she entered, replaced by a brittle silence that spoke volumes more than any conversation could. "Good afternoon, ladies," Miss Marple said softly, smiling with the warmth that had disarmed many before her. "I wonder if I might have a word with you, Elsie." A slender girl with striking auburn hair, who had been scrubbing the edge of the pantry door with a worn cloth, paused and looked up. Her eyes were large and expressive, though clouded with apprehension. She nodded cautiously and followed Miss Marple into the corner by the larder, away from prying ears. "I understand it's a difficult time," Miss Marple began gently, "but I wonder if you noticed anything unusual this morning, perhaps in the morning room or during preparations for the party." Elsie swallowed nervously. I did, Miss Marple. I mean, I'm not sure it's important, but—" She hesitated, then took a breath. "I saw Mr. Blake in the morning room quite early, before anyone else arrived." Miss Marple's eyes brightened just enough to encourage her to continue. He seemed agitated, pacing, talking quietly to himself. He had a small bottle with him. I thought it was medicine. She glanced down, but then I smelled it. It was lavender oil, very strong. He was rubbing it on his wrists and temples. "Lavender, you say?" "Yes, ma'am. I thought it was strange, but he looked so troubled." "And did he speak to anyone else?" "No, not really." Just once I heard him mutter a name. Edmund. And something about a deal gone wrong. Then he looked out the window for a long time. Miss Marple folded her hands. Thank you, Elsie. You've been most helpful. As Elsie returned to her duties, Miss Marple pondered the significance. Lavender oil, a scent commonly used for calm and clarity, but also known, when applied heavily, to mask other odors. And a muttered reference to Edmund Hargrove, the solicitor, implied the tension over the property was far more personal than the polite conversation at tea suggested. She returned to the drawing-room just as Lady Sedgwick was preparing to speak with Inspector Hayward again. The room had quieted further, the earlier unrest replaced by a heavy, expectant hush. Lady Sedgwick, Miss Marple said, approaching with her usual ease, might I ask you a question? The lady inclined her head graciously, but without her usual composure. Of course, Miss Marple. You mentioned that Mr. Blake had arrived 3 days ago. Do you recall if he met with Mr. Hargrove during that time? Lady Sedgwick hesitated, a flicker of something almost like fear crossing her face. They spoke briefly. It was a business matter, but I was not privy to the details. And how did Mr. Hargrove respond to Mr. Blake's claims? There was a long pause. Mr. Hargrove was dismissive. He believed the claims unfounded and was reluctant to engage. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Thank you. Nearby, Edmund Hargrove listened with a tight jaw and clenched fists. Miss Marple caught the flicker of his gaze and chose her next words carefully. Mr. Hargrove, did you happen to see Mr. Blake yesterday or earlier today? I had no reason to speak to him. The man was a nuisance, Hargrove replied bluntly, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. Yet he left you a letter. An attempt at negotiation, Hargrove said tersely. It was clear to all involved that his claim had no merit. Miss Marple allowed the conversation to rest there, sensing the tension was ready to boil over, but that the moment was not quite ripe. Instead, she turned her attention to Beatrice Hartnell, who was sitting quietly in the corner, her face pale but composed. Miss Marple settled beside her again. Beatrice, she said gently, you seemed distressed earlier. Is there something troubling you? The young woman glanced around as if seeking privacy before lowering her voice. It's just... I overheard a conversation last night between my aunt and Mr. Hargrove. They were arguing, quietly but heatedly. Something about the will and about money owed. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled behind her spectacles. And what exactly did they say? Beatrice bit her lip. That Mr. Blake was dangerous. That if he pursued his claim it would ruin the family's reputation and finances. Aunt was very upset. Did your aunt say why? No, only that it was a secret that must never be revealed. The implication hung in the air like a dense fog. Miss Marple was beginning to see that this was no simple land dispute. There were deeper currents swirling beneath. Before she could inquire further, a sudden commotion by the front door drew the room's attention. Constable Ellis was ushering in a small, timid figure, Mrs. Pratt, the housekeeper. Her usually steely demeanor was replaced by a pale, shaken expression. Mrs. Pratt, Inspector Hayward asked, stepping forward, is there something you wish to tell us? The housekeeper nodded slowly. Yes, Inspector. I believe there's something important you should know. It concerns Mr. Blake and the morning of his death. All eyes turned to her, anticipation tightening the atmosphere. It's about the servant's schedule, she began, voice wavering slightly. The new maid, Elsie, mentioned a bottle of lavender oil Mr. Blake used. What she didn't know is that the bottle is missing from the housekeeper's cupboard this morning. Miss Marple leaned forward, her expression steady. Missing? Yes, ma'am. I was certain it was here last night. We keep track of all bottles and cleaning supplies meticulously. But this morning it was gone. Only the empty box remained. Have you spoken to Elsie about this? Mrs. Pratt nodded. I did. She seemed nervous when I asked. Said she had seen the bottle with Mr. Blake, but insisted she hadn't taken it. The housekeeper's eyes flicked nervously toward the kitchen door. Miss Marple rose, her mind racing. The bottle was a key detail, and its disappearance pointed to a new possibility, that the lavender oil was more than just a calming scent. Perhaps it was part of a poison or a means to conceal something more sinister. Inspector Hayward wasted no time. "I want a search of the entire house, every room, every drawer, every cabinet." The search was thorough but yielded little, except for one discovery. In a drawer of the morning room's desk, a small folded piece of paper slipped behind the bookshelves. Miss Marple's keen eyes spotted it first, retrieving it with a delicate hand. It was a note, hastily written. "Trust no one. The past is not buried. The will hides a secret." No signature. A collective murmur rippled through the room as the note passed from hand to hand, each guest and resident stealing a glance. Miss Marple tucked it away carefully. This cryptic message confirmed that the dispute over the will was not merely legal, but deeply personal, and that someone was desperate to keep the truth hidden. That truth, she suspected, had been the motive for murder. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, tensions rose. Edmund Hargrove's stern composure cracked under questioning about the will's details, and Lady Sedgwick became visibly more agitated when Miss Marple gently probed into family matters. The locked door mystery, the missing lavender oil, the secretive note, all threads in a tapestry of long-buried resentments and veiled threats. Miss Marple observed quietly from her seat near the window, the familiar hum of village life now tainted by suspicion and fear. She understood that the puzzle was far from solved. The locked room was only the beginning. The true challenge was unmasking the intricate web of lies and secrets that had led to Howard Blake's death. And she knew that the smallest slip, the briefest hesitation, would soon reveal the murderer hiding in plain sight. The late afternoon sun cast a muted glow through the tall mullioned windows, painting the drawing room in soft hues of amber and shadow. Miss Marple sat poised in her favorite chair near the hearth, her knitting forgotten in her lap as she observed the restless gathering before her. The air was thick with unspoken accusations and guarded glances. The room, once a sanctuary for genteel conversation, had become a stage for subtle, unspoken warfare. Inspector Hayward paced by the fireplace, flipping through his notes with a furrowed brow. The presence of the note Miss Marple had found weighed heavily on everyone's minds, and it was clear the investigation was no longer a simple matter of legal disputes or accidental death. There was malice here, and a carefully concealed secret beneath layers of polite civility. Lady Sedgwick sat stiffly in her chair, hands clenched around a lace handkerchief, her pale eyes darting occasionally toward her nephew, Edmund Hargrove. His jaw was set firm, but the tension in his shoulders betrayed his inner turmoil. Near them, Beatrice Hartnell fidgeted nervously, stealing glances at both and then at Miss Marple, who returned her gaze with a calm, reassuring smile. Breaking the silence, Inspector Hayward cleared his throat. "I've spoken to the servants at length," he said, voice carrying the weight of authority. "No one admits to taking the lavender oil from the housekeeper's cupboard, though it was certainly present yesterday. The maid Elsie appears truthful but nervous, and Mrs. Pratt confirms the oil's disappearance." Edmund Hargrove's voice interrupted sharply. "How on earth can a missing bottle of lavender oil relate to the death? Are we now to believe that the butler or the maid is guilty by association?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled beneath her spectacles, and she inclined her head politely. "Sometimes, Mr. Hargrove, the smallest detail can reveal the largest truth. Poison can be disguised in many forms. Oils and tinctures are not exempt." Hayward nodded gravely. "We're looking into the possibility of poisoning as a cause of death. The coroner's report is inconclusive, but does mention traces of an unusual substance in the victim's system. We're awaiting further analysis." A collective gasp rippled through the assembled guests. Lady Sedgwick's face turned a shade paler, and Beatrice's hand flew to her mouth. Miss Marple rose and moved toward the window, drawing aside the curtain slightly to gaze out over the estate's gardens, where a solitary figure lingered near the rose bushes. It was the new maid, Elsie, her auburn hair catching the dying light as she appeared to be nervously arranging the blooms. Turning back to the room, Miss Marple spoke quietly but firmly. "We must consider who stood to gain from Mr. Blake's death, not merely in legal terms, but in social and familial ones. The note we found references a secret in the will, a secret someone fears to be revealed." Edmund scoffed, stepping forward. "There's nothing secret about the will. It was disputed, yes, but the facts are straightforward." "Are they?" Miss Marple replied softly. "Disputes seldom arise from clarity, Mr. Hargrove, and secrets, by their nature, prefer the shadows." Lady Sedgwick, her composure fracturing, suddenly spoke. "Howard was not simply a claimant. He was involved in something from the past, something that ties us all together, whether we like it or not." A hush fell over the room. Edmund's eyes narrowed. "Mother, what are you implying?" "That there is more to this family's history than we've admitted," Lady Sedgwick said, voice trembling but resolute. "Howard Blake's arrival stirred up old ghosts, ones some would kill to keep buried." Beatrice shifted uneasily. "Aunt, please." "No, child," Lady Sedgwick said firmly. "The truth must come out." Miss Marple observed the dynamics carefully. Lady Sedgwick's rare emotional display was telling. The matriarch was burdened with secrets, and her reaction suggested guilt mixed with fear. "I believe," Miss Marple said, "that we should look again at the past disputes between these families. Secrets tend to fester beneath polite smiles, but they leave traces, in letters, in old documents, in memories." Inspector Hayward nodded thoughtfully. "I've requested the household's archives be brought here. Any correspondence between the Sedgwicks, the Hartnells, and Mr. Blake or his associates will be examined." The door opened gently, and the butler, Mr. Fenwick, entered carrying a bundle of aged papers tied with a faded ribbon. "These were found in the library, Inspector," he said quietly. "Old correspondence and legal documents relating to the property and the families involved." Hayward took the bundle and began to sift through it carefully. The room grew tense as the truth seemed poised to emerge from the dusty pages. Miss Marple, meanwhile, turned her attention to the guests, watching as subtle reactions betrayed their inner thoughts. Edmund's sharp glances, Lady Sedgwick's pale anxiety, Beatrice's nervous fidgeting, all were clues in themselves. Suddenly, the inspector looked up, his face more serious. "There's something here," he announced. "A letter from the late Mr. Crawley, former partner in the West Indies business and original co-owner of the land in question. It was written months before his death and mentions a codicil to his will that was never made public." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "A hidden clause?" "Exactly. And this codicil apparently names Howard Blake as a beneficiary, with certain conditions attached, conditions that would significantly alter the inheritance." Edmund's face flushed with anger. "This is outrageous. If there was such a clause, it should have been disclosed years ago." Lady Sedgwick sank back into her chair, trembling. It was hidden deliberately, to protect the family name. Beatrice's eyes met Miss Marple's. But who would hide it? And why would that person want Howard dead? The question hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "That, my dear, is what we must discover." As the evening drew in, the household settled into uneasy silence, each person retreating into their own thoughts and fears. Yet Miss Marple remained alert, her mind weaving together the strands of suspicion, motive, and opportunity. She knew the answer lay not just in the documents or the locks on the door, but in the fragile human emotions that linked this house of secrets. Envy, betrayal, desperation, and fear. And somewhere in that web, the murderer waited, confident that their carefully constructed facade would hold. But Miss Marple was patient. The smallest slip, the faintest tremor, would soon reveal the truth behind the locked door and the deadly secret it guarded. The day unfolded under a pall of quiet tension. Miss Marple observed the household with an ever keener eye as Inspector Hayward began the methodical process of questioning the family and staff once again. Each person's movements, words, and expressions were clues in themselves, and though the police focused on facts, it was the subtle human undercurrents that intrigued Miss Marple most. The first to be questioned was Mr. Fenwick, the butler, who appeared composed but showed slight signs of strain. His usual measured tone betrayed occasional hesitations. When asked about his whereabouts the afternoon before, he responded, "I was attending to various duties in the West Wing, including ensuring the dining arrangements for the party were in order." "Did you have access to the morning room?" Hayward pressed. "Yes," Fenwick admitted. "I passed the room several times, but I did not enter. The door was locked as usual." Miss Marple caught the flicker of unease in Fenwick's eyes and noted how his hands clenched slightly. Next was Elsie, the new maid, whose nervous demeanor contrasted sharply with the others. She recounted her day meticulously, her voice quavering slightly when mentioning seeing Fenwick near the morning room. Miss Marple could tell she was being truthful. Fear and loyalty mingled in her glance. Beatrice was questioned after. She appeared distressed but cooperative. "I was in the gardens most of the afternoon," she said. "I saw Mr. Blake speaking with several villagers before the gathering. I didn't notice anything unusual." Edmund's alibi was less solid. He claimed to have been in the study, but no one could verify his exact whereabouts for a short period around the time of death. Lady Sedgwick declined to answer many questions, citing the strain on her health, but her sharp eyes missed little. Miss Marple herself stayed quiet, listening more than speaking, observing how the web of relationships twisted and pulled taut under scrutiny. Later, as the inspector reviewed his notes, Miss Marple found herself walking the corridors alone, drawn back to the morning room. The locked door still held its secrets, but the slight soil trace and rose petal stuck in the carpet teased at a hidden passage or exit. As she examined the paneling closely, her fingers brushed a small groove almost imperceptible to the touch. Following it, she found a loose board. With careful effort, she pried it open, revealing a narrow crawl space beyond. It was dark and musty, but unmistakably a passage connecting to the garden outside. A realization dawned. Someone had used this secret route to enter or exit the room unseen, bypassing the locked door and window. The mystery of the locked door was no longer a barrier, but a deliberate misdirection. Miss Marple's mind traced the implications. The murderer had knowledge of the house's hidden architecture, knowledge likely limited to someone long familiar with the estate. Returning to the drawing room, she shared this discovery with Inspector Hayward and the small group still assembled. "This passage," she explained, "explains how the door was locked from inside and out, yet the killer escaped without detection. But only someone with intimate knowledge of the house could have used it." Edmund's face tightened, and Lady Sedgwick's lips pressed into a thin line. Beatrice looked startled, as if just now comprehending the breadth of deception. Hayward nodded slowly. "We must consider who among you had the means and the opportunity to use this passage." Questions multiplied. The passage was old, hidden from common knowledge, and used rarely. Mr. Fenwick, who had overseen the household for years, might know of it. But what about the others? Miss Marple's gaze settled on Edmund. "Mr. Hargrove, you have lived here longer than any other member of the household except Lady Sedgwick and Mr. Fenwick. Would you say you are familiar with every corner of the estate?" Edmund hesitated. "I knew of some passages, yes, but I never used them." "But someone did," Miss Marple said softly, "and they had reason to avoid being seen." As the afternoon wore on, the inspector conducted a more detailed search of the estate, guided by Miss Marple's discovery. The servants were questioned again about any unusual movements, and the gardener was asked if he had noticed anything odd near the rose bushes. Beatrice, summoned to assist with the papers and correspondence, stumbled upon an envelope tucked inside an old ledger, a letter addressed to Howard Blake in a handwriting matching the note Miss Marple had found. The letter was brief but explosive, implying that one of the family members had been involved in fraudulent dealings, threatening Howard's claim and reputation. It was signed with the initials E.H. Beatrice showed the letter to Miss Marple privately. Could this be Edmund's handwriting? Miss Marple examined the script carefully, comparing it to letters previously seen. There was a strong resemblance. The possibility that Edmund might have tried to intimidate Howard added a darker shade to his motives. That evening, during a quiet moment, Miss Marple invited Edmund to join her for tea. The younger man was reluctant, but agreed, perhaps sensing the old lady's gentle persistence. Sipping her tea, Miss Marple began, "Mr. Hargrove, your family's name carries weight in this village. Secrets, however, have a way of coming to light, no matter how deeply buried." Edmund shifted uneasily. "I have nothing to hide, Miss Marple." "Yet you sought to discourage Mr. Blake, did you not? The letter suggests a desire to keep certain matters quiet." Edmund's jaw clenched. It was a warning, nothing more. He was meddling in affairs that could ruin more than just our family's reputation. "And yet," she continued softly, "your warning came too late, and now he is dead." Edmund's eyes flickered with something unreadable. "I didn't kill him." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "I believe you, but that does not mean others did not act in desperation." The conversation ended with no confession, but a veil of suspicion had deepened. Miss Marple knew the next days would require more patience and subtlety. Meanwhile, Lady Sedgwick's health was deteriorating, and she requested to see Miss Marple privately. In the dimly lit parlor, she confided in a fragile voice, "Howard's death has unhinged more than the family. The past is catching up, and I fear the worst." Miss Marple pressed gently, "What is it you fear, Lady Sedgwick?" "That there is someone among us who cannot bear the truth to emerge, someone who will go to any length to preserve their secret." Miss Marple understood then that this was no ordinary murder of passion or greed. It was a desperate attempt to silence the past. As night fell once more on the estate, the locked door remained a silent sentinel to secrets long held and lies carefully maintained. But in the quiet watchfulness of one keen observer, the threads of the mystery were slowly weaving toward their inevitable unraveling. The morning light sifted softly through the lace curtains as Miss Marple sat quietly at her usual corner of the drawing-room, knitting needles clicking rhythmically in a steady cadence that belied the intensity of her thoughts. The weight of recent revelations hung heavily in the air. The hidden passageway, the incriminating letter, the growing suspicion around Edmund, all were threads carefully entwined in a fabric of secrets. Yet to Miss Marple, the tapestry was not yet complete. Inspector Hayward paced the length of the room, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Miss Marple," he said abruptly, breaking the silence, "we found something peculiar in the garden this morning." He produced a small folded piece of paper, its edges stained and crumpled. It was hidden beneath the rose bush near the morning room. Miss Marple took the paper with delicate fingers and unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was neat and precise, a stark contrast to the frantic scrawl of the notes found earlier. The letter read, "They think the estate's debts are unknown, but I know where the truth lies. Trust no one but yourself. H.B." "Howard Blake," Miss Marple murmured. "Still sending warnings from beyond the grave, it seems." Hayward frowned. "Do you think it's a clue left deliberately for someone? Or a message meant to mislead?" "Both possibilities merit consideration," she replied thoughtfully. "It suggests that Howard suspected betrayal, perhaps from within his own family." The inspector's gaze drifted toward Edmund Hargrove, who stood near the window, arms crossed, his face an unreadable mask. Miss Marple's eyes softened slightly as she observed him. Beneath his veneer of anger and defensiveness, There lingered a man overwhelmed by the unraveling of his carefully maintained world. Later that morning, Miss Marple requested to speak with Beatrice Hartnell privately. The young woman appeared pale, shadows under her eyes betraying sleepless nights. "Miss Marple," Beatrice said quietly, "I feel like I'm living in a nightmare. Howard was like a brother to me, and now, all these secrets coming out, it's tearing the village apart." Miss Marple nodded gently. "Sometimes, Miss Hartnell, the truth can be painful, but it also brings light. Have you noticed anything unusual in the days leading to Howard's death? Any new faces or strange happenings?" Beatrice hesitated, then spoke in a low voice. "There was someone, a man, unknown to me, who came calling a few days ago. He left quickly when I asked who he was, but he seemed very interested in the family papers." "Did you see his face clearly?" "No, but he wore a dark coat and spoke with a slight accent. I thought little of it at the time, but now I wonder." Miss Marple's mind raced. A stranger visiting the estate, showing interest in the documents that Howard had fought to expose. It was a vital piece of the puzzle. The afternoon brought another disturbance. The gardener, Mr. Collins, approached Miss Marple with a troubled expression. "Miss Marple, I found this," he said, handing her a torn fragment of fabric caught on a thorny branch near the secret passage's garden exit. The cloth was delicate, embroidered with fine stitching, unmistakably belonging to a woman's garment. Miss Marple's thoughts flickered immediately to Lady Sedgwick. She was known for her taste in fine clothing, and the piece matched the delicate fabric of the gown Lady Sedgwick had worn at the gathering. Later, Lady Sedgwick was found in the library, her face pale, her hands trembling. "Lady Sedgwick," Miss Marple said gently, "may I ask if you recall losing a piece of your dress?" The lady nodded faintly. I don't remember. Perhaps when I was walking in the garden." Miss Marple's gaze was steady. "Did you visit the morning room or its vicinity yesterday afternoon?" Lady Sedgwick hesitated, then admitted, "Yes, I was there briefly to retrieve some letters. I did not realize the door was locked." Miss Marple smiled inwardly. Lady Sedgwick's nervousness was a telling sign. Perhaps more was hidden beneath her delicate exterior. That evening the family gathered once more. Tensions simmered beneath polite exchanges and forced smiles. Inspector Hayward announced that all the evidence, including the hidden passage and the letters, had been catalogued, but the mystery deepened. Miss Marple spoke quietly. "The passage is a key to understanding the crime, but it is not the whole story. The fabric found in the garden, Lady Sedgwick's secret visit, the unknown visitor Beatrice described, they are threads in a complex web." Edmund's temper flared suddenly. "Enough of this insinuation. I have done nothing but suffer because of Howard's lies and the village's suspicions." Miss Marple's eyes met his, calm and unyielding. "Mr. Hargrove, your pain is evident, but it is not proof of guilt. We must look beyond appearances." As the night deepened, Miss Marple found herself walking the corridors once again, reflecting on the day's revelations. She stopped at the door of the morning room, her hand resting lightly on the knob. Inside, secrets waited patiently, but time was running short. Suddenly, a soft noise drew her attention. From the shadows, Beatrice emerged, her face pale and determined. "Miss Marple," she whispered urgently, "I found something in the study. A ledger hidden behind a loose panel in the bookshelf. It contains financial records that suggest a large sum of money disappeared just before Howard's death." Miss Marple's eyes sparkled with quiet triumph. "That is precisely the kind of detail we need, Miss Hartnell. The motive is becoming clearer." Together, they moved toward the study, the flickering candlelight casting long shadows on the walls. The ledger's pages revealed transactions, debts, and payments that contradicted the family's public image of solvency and respectability. Miss Marple turned to Beatrice. "Someone here was desperate to keep these financial secrets buried. and desperate enough to kill. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees as if urging the truth to emerge before the night swallowed it whole. Inside, behind locked doors and carefully maintained facades, the house waited, patient and silent, for the final pieces to fall into place. The study was hushed, save for the gentle rustling of pages as Miss Marple and Beatrice pored over the ledger's contents. The aged book, with its cracked spine and yellowing sheets, seemed almost reluctant to divulge its secrets, but the numbers told a story that could not be ignored. Miss Marple's finger traced a particular entry dated just weeks before Howard Blake's death, a large withdrawal, unaccounted for, from the estate's funds. The handwriting was deliberate, yet unfamiliar, suggesting an outsider or someone trying to disguise their involvement. Beatrice leaned in, whispering, "This must be what the stranger was after. Whoever visited the estate recently was looking for proof." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed, "and if this money vanished without explanation, it could give any number of people a motive to silence Howard, especially if he was threatening exposure." Their quiet examination was interrupted by a soft knock on the door. Inspector Hayward entered, his expression grave but curious. "Miss Marple, I've just spoken with Fenwick again," he said. "He admits that about a month ago he overheard an argument between Edmund and Howard in the morning room. He said the voices were raised, heated even." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Tensions have been simmering beneath the surface for some time. It seems the financial troubles and family disputes are more intertwined than we first realized." Fenwick also mentioned seeing Lady Sedgwick near the passage on the night of the murder, though she claims otherwise. Beatrice's eyes widened. "Why would she lie about that?" "Because, my dear, people rarely lie without reason," Miss Marple said softly. "And in this house, truth and deception are often partners in a very delicate dance." Later, as the daylight began to fade, Miss Marple requested a private meeting with Lady Sedgwick. In the quiet intimacy of the drawing room, away from prying eyes and ears, the elderly lady finally spoke. "My health has been poor, and the events have taken a toll," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "But there are things I must confess. Howard was not only my nephew, but also the keeper of secrets I had hoped would remain buried." Miss Marple leaned forward, encouraging her to continue. "There were rumors, many years ago, of misdeeds involving the estate's finances. Howard discovered irregularities, fraud, embezzlement, possibly orchestrated by someone close." Lady Sedgwick's eyes glistened with tears. "He intended to expose the truth, but feared the consequences for the family name. I begged him to reconsider, to protect us all." "And did you think someone might have silenced him to prevent that?" Miss Marple asked gently. "Yes," Lady Sedgwick replied, her voice trembling. "I feared for his safety, and now it seems my fears were justified." The evening's revelations weighed heavily on Miss Marple's mind as she considered the interplay of loyalty, fear, and desperation that had consumed the household. Before retiring for the night, she took a moment to revisit the morning room, now stripped of its earlier secrecy. The window was slightly ajar, and outside, the garden lay serene beneath a silvered moon. A sudden movement caught her eye, a figure retreating into the shadows. "Who's there?" Miss Marple called softly. The figure hesitated, then stepped forward. It was Beatrice, clutching a small envelope. "I found this in the servants' quarters," she said, handing it over. "It was addressed to Howard, but never delivered." Miss Marple opened it carefully. Inside was a letter, the words scrawled hastily. "If you do not cease your inquiries, the consequences will be dire. There are forces stronger than you realize." The threat was clear, and the danger close. The next morning, the household gathered once more under the watchful eye of Inspector Hayward. The pieces were falling into place, but the puzzle was still incomplete. Miss Marple's gaze swept over the faces before her, each bearing the marks of worry, guilt, or fear. Her subtle observations revealed what the others missed. A trembling hand here, a fleeting glance there, a hesitation too long to be mere coincidence. As she prepared to speak, the air in the room grew charged with anticipation. The final game was about to begin, a psychological dance where the truth would be coaxed from the shadows, and the murderer, unwittingly, would reveal themselves. Miss Marple's voice was calm, almost gentle as she addressed the assembly. There is one among us who has taken great pains to hide a terrible secret. But secrets, like shadows, grow longer with the setting sun. Soon, the truth will stand in the light, undeniable and clear. Eyes shifted, breaths caught, and somewhere in that quiet room, the door that had been locked from the inside and out was beginning to creak open. The room fell into a tense hush as Miss Marple's words hung in the air like a delicate thread pulled taut, threatening to snap at any moment. Faces turned uncertain, eyes flickering nervously from one person to another, as if each suspected the other. The grand house, so full of history and whispered secrets, seemed to close in upon them all. Inspector Hayward cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "Miss Marple, if you have reason to believe the murderer is here, now is the time to speak." Miss Marple nodded slowly, her gaze steady but gentle. "Patience, Inspector. The truth is rarely rushed, and the heart of this mystery lies not merely in evidence but in human nature." She stepped forward, her voice soft yet compelling. "We have uncovered many pieces of this puzzle. A hidden passageway, a threatened ledger, secret visits, and veiled threats. Yet none of these are the final key. The true motive and culprit reveal themselves through actions observed, words left unsaid, and, most importantly, through the subtle changes in a person's demeanor when confronted by the truth." Her eyes fixed on Edmund Hargrove. "You have been quick to anger, Mr. Hargrove, and your bitterness toward your late uncle has been known. But anger, while a powerful emotion, does not alone make one a killer." Edmund bristled, his jaw tightening. "I have nothing to confess. I merely wish for justice to be done and for my family's name to be cleared." Miss Marple turned to Lady Sedgwick, who sat clutching a handkerchief, her face pale. "Lady Sedgwick, you spoke of fears for Howard's safety and the desire to keep family secrets buried. It is natural to want to protect one's kin, but sometimes protection comes at a grave cost." Lady Sedgwick's lips quivered, but she remained silent. Miss Marple shifted her attention to Beatrice Hartnell, who sat quietly, her eyes wide but resolute. "Miss Hartnell, you have been brave throughout this ordeal, and your discovery of the ledger has shed much light. Yet you mentioned a visitor, an unknown man with a dark coat and accent, who sought the family papers. Tell us more of this stranger." Beatrice nodded, her voice steady. "I only saw him briefly. He left quickly when I asked questions, but his presence felt ominous. I suspect he was not acting alone." "Indeed," Miss Marple said softly. "Sometimes the threads we pull reveal deeper knots beneath." At that moment, a sharp rap came from the front door. The household looked toward the sound, tension mounting. The butler entered, announcing an unexpected visitor. Mr. James Merton, a solicitor from London, arrived with urgent news. Mr. Merton was ushered into the drawing-room, where he presented a sealed envelope addressed to Howard Blake, discovered among his personal effects after the tragedy. The letter inside was written in a familiar hand, cryptic but telling. Miss Marple read aloud. "The truth you seek is not within these walls, but lies buried in the past. Beware those who wear masks, for beneath the guise of loyalty lies treachery." The room reacted with a mixture of shock and unease. The message confirmed that the motives behind Howard's murder were entangled with old grievances reaching back decades. Inspector Hayward spoke gravely. "Miss Marple, this suggests that the killer's motive may be rooted in something far older than the current disputes." "Precisely," Miss Marple replied, "and that is why we must look not only at recent quarrels, but also at the shadows cast by long-forgotten actions." As the afternoon waned, Miss Marple requested another private conversation, this time with Fenwick, the gardener. The old man was reluctant but cooperative, and his nervous manner hinted he was guarding a secret. "Mr. Fenwick," Miss Marple began kindly, "you mentioned overhearing an argument between Edmund and Howard. Did you notice anything unusual about that evening? Any other voices or someone arriving unexpectedly?" Fenwick swallowed hard. "There was someone else. I thought it was just the wind or my imagination at first, but I heard footsteps on the stairs. Someone moving quickly, trying not to be seen." "Could you recognize the footsteps?" she asked gently. "No, but the rhythm was different. Lighter, quicker, like a woman's." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. "Thank you, Fenwick. That is a valuable observation." Back in the drawing room, Miss Marple gathered everyone once more, the house feeling smaller, the walls seeming to lean in as the weight of suspicion grew heavier. "Someone in this house moved silently, unnoticed, under the cover of darkness," she said quietly. "And that person took advantage of a locked door, a hidden passage, and the distractions of an angry family to carry out a dreadful deed." Her gaze settled on Lady Sedgwick, who shrank slightly in her chair. "Lady Sedgwick," Miss Marple continued, "you admitted to being near the morning room the night Howard died, yet you denied knowledge of the locked doors. You also have reason to fear exposure, and the delicate fabric found in the garden suggests you were present where you claimed not to be." Lady Sedgwick's voice broke as she whispered, "I did not kill Howard. I only wanted to protect the family from ruin." "But protection can take many forms," Miss Marple said gently. "Sometimes it leads to desperation, and desperation to crime." Before the lady could respond, the door opened quietly, and Beatrice entered, holding a small bundle. "I found this in the hidden passage," she said breathlessly. "A torn photograph of Howard and someone else, their faces crossed out." Miss Marple took the photograph and studied it carefully. The second figure was a woman whose features were familiar, yet elusive. "Miss Hartnell," she said. "Do you recognize her?" Beatrice shook her head slowly. "No, but I remember seeing a visitor in the village a few months ago, Mrs. Langford, a widow from the neighboring parish, who seemed overly interested in the estate's affairs." A murmur spread among the assembled guests. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "This mystery reaches beyond these walls, entwining old grudges, hidden visitors, and desperate acts," she said. "But the heart of it beats within this house, in the tangled relationships and silent fears of those who live here." As dusk deepened, the investigation moved toward its crescendo. Miss Marple's mind pieced together the subtle signs, the threatening letter, the shadowy visitor, Lady Sedgwick's nervousness, Edmund's anger, and now the mysterious woman in the photograph. Each was a vital note in the symphony of deceit. With a quiet resolve, Miss Marple prepared to set her final test, a delicate psychological game designed to draw out the killer's confession without accusation, trusting that human nature, when confronted with the truth, reveals itself in small, undeniable ways. The evening stretched ahead, long and full of quiet tension, with the locked doors and hidden passage awaiting the moment when the last secret would emerge and the true murderer would be unmasked. The drawing room was thick with a quiet anticipation as the evening shadows lengthened and the soft ticking of the antique clock echoed through the chamber. Miss Marple sat poised, a small smile playing at the corners of her lips, while the household's restless eyes flicked between one another. Each person bore the weight of suspicion, and the fragile veneer of civility was stretched to its breaking point. "Tonight," Miss Marple began, her voice gentle but firm, "I intend to play a little game, not with cards or dice, but with human nature itself, for it is often in the subtle shifts of expression, the faltering of a glance, or the slip of a word that the truth is most clearly revealed. Her gaze swept the room, settling briefly on each face. I ask you all to remain where you are and to listen carefully as I recount certain details of our investigation. The real culprit will surely betray themselves, unwittingly, if only we watch with kindness and patience. She turned first to Edmund Hargrove, whose defiant stance softened under her steady scrutiny. Edmund, you have been quite outspoken about your grievances and your desire for justice. Tell me, how do you feel about your uncle now, after all that has transpired? Edmund's jaw tightened as he answered. I admired him once, but his secrets and the damage they caused have changed that. Still, I would not harm him. Justice is what matters, even if it means uncovering unpleasant truths. Miss Marple inclined her head. A noble sentiment, though justice can be a complicated thing. Turning her attention to Lady Sedgwick, she asked, And you, Lady Sedgwick, do you feel your actions were justified, or did fear cloud your judgment? Lady Sedgwick's voice trembled. I only wished to protect the family from disgrace. I never imagined it would lead to such sorrow. Miss Marple's eyes held a glint of understanding. Fear often leads us to desperate acts, but it is the consequences we must face. The room fell silent as Miss Marple moved to Beatrice. Miss Hartnell, you discovered the ledger and found the threatening letter. You've been an invaluable ally. How do you see the situation now? Beatrice's voice was steady. It's clear the murder was planned, that the killer wanted to cover their tracks, but I believe the answer lies not in hiding, but in courage to face the truth. Indeed, Miss Marple said, smiling warmly. She then directed her attention to the assembled household. There is one among us whose fear of exposure led them to take a dreadful step. The locked doors, the hidden passage, the silent footsteps on the stairs, all were used to mask a crime born of desperation. Her eyes rested finally on Lady Sedgwick, whose composure was visibly faltering. Lady Sedgwick, you have been evasive about your movements on the night of the murder. Care to explain? Lady Sedgwick swallowed hard, her voice barely audible. I was near the morning room because I hoped to find Howard. I wanted to stop him from revealing what he had found. I never meant to harm him. But harm came nonetheless, Miss Marple replied gently. A sudden movement at the door drew all eyes. Inspector Hayward stepped forward, his hand holding a piece of fabric, delicate and torn, matching the material found in the garden. We found this caught on the latch of the hidden passage. Lady Sedgwick's face drained of color. Miss Marple turned toward Beatrice. You found a torn photograph of Howard and a woman, Mrs. Langford, I believe. Beatrice nodded. She had been visiting the village and seemed unusually interested in the estate's affairs. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. Mrs. Langford, as it turns out, was not as innocuous as she appeared. Our inquiries revealed she had a past with Howard's late father, a history tangled with betrayal and greed. She sought the ledger to claim what she believed was rightfully hers. A knock sounded on the door once more, and a messenger entered, handing Inspector Hayward a note. The inspector read aloud, I know the truth and am willing to speak. Meet me at the garden gate at midnight. The room buzzed with nervous energy. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed with quiet satisfaction. This is the moment we have awaited. The final piece to the puzzle will soon be placed. As night deepened, Miss Marple and Inspector Hayward waited silently by the garden gate. The moonlight cast long shadows, and the air was thick with tension. From the darkness emerged Mrs. Langford, her face pale but resolute. I came because I could no longer live with the lies, she said. Howard discovered what I had done years ago. Embezzlement from the family business. I followed him here, hoping to retrieve the ledger and keep my secret safe. But things spiraled out of control. She confessed to confronting Howard that night, and in a struggle, the fatal blow was struck. The locked doors and hidden passage were her desperate attempt to cover her tracks and escape unnoticed. Miss Marple listened with quiet understanding, then said, Your remorse is clear, Mrs. Langford. But justice must be served, and the truth must not remain locked away. Back inside, the household absorbed the gravity of the confession. Lady Sedgwick's fears were misplaced, Edmund's anger redirected, and Beatrice's courage vindicated. As the dawn approached, the village of Westbridge breathed a tentative sigh of relief. The door that had been locked from the inside and out was finally open, revealing not only the murderer, but the fragile human truths that lay beneath. Miss Marple, ever composed, reflected quietly on the complexity of human nature, the fears, the secrets, the courage to face consequences. In the peaceful light of morning, Westbridge would never be quite the same. But through the darkness, a steady hand had guided the way to truth, proving once more that in the heart of a quiet village, mysteries could be unraveled by a gentle yet unyielding mind. As the first golden rays of morning filtered softly through the lace curtains, the great house of Westbridge Manor seemed to exhale a long-held breath. The shadows that had clung to its walls during the dark hours were lifting, replaced by the gentle light of truth, finally unveiled. Miss Marple sat quietly in the drawing-room, a teacup resting lightly in her hand. The assembled household gathered once more. The tension between them softened now by understanding and the final closure of the terrible events that had shaken their peaceful village. "It is often said," Miss Marple began, her voice calm and steady, "that the truth lies behind locked doors and silent walls. In this case, quite literally. The locked doors of the morning room and the hidden passage were more than mere architectural curiosities. They were the stage upon which fear and desperation played their fateful part." She paused, allowing her words to settle. "The man who came to us in the night, Mrs. Langford, confessed to a desperate attempt to conceal her past wrongdoings. Her act of violence, though grievous, was born from the fear of exposure and loss. Yet it is important to remember that while the act was hers, the roots of the crime stretched back years, tangled with secrets kept by others and the unspoken burdens of family." Turning her gaze gently toward Lady Sedgwick, Miss Marple continued, "Lady Sedgwick's protective instincts, though misdirected, arose from a genuine desire to shield her family. She became entangled in the web of deception unwittingly, a reminder that even well-meaning actions can complicate the truth." Edmund, standing nearby, nodded slowly. His earlier bitterness softened into reluctant acceptance. Miss Marple smiled faintly at Beatrice Hartnell, who had shown quiet bravery throughout. "And you, Miss Hartnell, your curiosity and kindness have been instrumental in unraveling the mystery. It is often those who observe with a gentle eye who see what others miss." Inspector Hayward stepped forward, clearing his throat. "Thanks to Miss Marple's keen insight and the cooperation of all involved, the case is now closed. Mrs. Langford will face the consequences of her actions, but it is hoped that this community can begin to heal." Miss Marple rose and approached the window, gazing out over the awakening village. "Human nature is a tapestry of contradictions, fear and courage, selfishness and sacrifice, truth and concealment. In this quiet corner of England, these contradictions revealed themselves, hidden behind locked doors and silent passages." She turned back to the group, her expression gentle but resolute. "May we all remember that it is not only the secrets we keep, but the courage we summon to face them that shapes our lives." As the villagers dispersed, a newfound quiet settled over Westbridge Manor. The locked door that had once symbolized mystery and danger now stood as a testament to the truth's eventual triumph. Miss Marple, settling back into her chair, allowed herself a small, knowing smile. In the calm after the storm, she reflected once more on the delicate balance of human nature. Forever complex, endlessly fascinating, and ever worthy of gentle scrutiny. The case was closed, but the village, like all places touched by secrets and sorrow, would carry the memory of this night for many years to come. And somewhere deep in the folds of that memory, Miss Marple's quiet genius would remain, ever watchful, ever wise.